Is there anyone on Zoom?
I think Jen is. Oh, got a couple.
Just Kim?
Jen and Josh,
That's it.
our IT and our finance,
Oh, okay. Who's Jen and Josh?
our employees.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're right.
BPW employees.
So the second point I wanted to make was that every business is barraged by data. It can come from your customers, it can come from your suppliers, it can come from the government, it can come from your staff, it comes from competitors. You're barraged by this data. To make a decision, you have to have information. And to get the information, you've got to know what data to filter in and what data to filter out. And you've got to be able to process and structure the data in a way that you can actually make a business decision. Finance is an organizational structure. Financial structures are an organizational structure to help you do that. So as we go through here, I want you to kind of continuously ask yourself, would this help me make a better business decision for the organization? The third point I want to make is the difference between accounting and finance. Accounting and finance to a lot of people look like
No, we know.
sisters.
Well, I don't know about we, but I'm majored in finance.
Yeah, so
There's
you
an
know,
extreme
yeah.
difference.
It's a little bit like math and physics. You know,
Mhm.
they're not the same. They use each other. They talk some of the same language, but they are distinct disciplines. Accounting and finance are distinct disciplines. For the context of what we're going to be talking about, I like to think about accountants as the financial historians of the organization. Accounting as a profession is taking data that has already occurred or information that's already been achieved and or organizing it in structures that are set up by FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, in a gap-oriented framework, and they'll create balance sheets and income statements and cash flow statements. But it's a well-structured, way of looking at data that's already occurred. Finance is about the future. So where an accountant is the financial historian of the firm, a finance person, a finance analyst is sort of the financial futurist of the firm. Finance is about the future. It's about the business as an ongoing concern. It's about where it's going in the future, about the decisions that you're going to make the business survive. So as we go through here, I'm going to make some distinctions about accounting versus finance. This is a financial structure, not an accounting structure, but we do have some accounting language in here. Fourth thing I want to talk about is cash flow versus accrual accounting, or at least recognition. Accountants tend to use accrual methods. When a sale has been made, when an economic process is largely complete, including the sales process, they will recognize the purchase or the sale or the expenditure or whatever as that economic process has come to an end. If it's not actually cash in hand, then you create an accounts receivable, as an example. Or if you actually haven't paid the expense that you've actually incurred, then you've got an accounts payable. That's sort of that accrual concept. There's a different concept, and it's called cash flow accounting. And that is when the effort is recognized when cash is in hand, or when you actually write that check when cash is out of hand. Accountants have recognized that there is a really big distinction between those two. And the balance sheet and income statement type structures that accountants use are on an accrual basis usually, or largely accrual basis, whereas a cash flow statement is on a cash flow basis. This structure that we're presenting here is a cash flow structure, not an accrual structure. From a finance perspective, the timing of cash flows matter. If someone was to offer you $1 million today or $1 million 10 years from now, everyone in this room would say, well, I'd rather take the 10 million now and not wait 10 years. Timing of cash flows matter, and it needs to be recognized in the system that we're structuring. There's also a solvency issue. If you can't pay a bill, but you say, I have an accounts receivable coming next, in 6 months, you're insolvent. So solvency is a problem as well. And that's why I think for the context of the business decisions that we're talking about here, we want to be more focused on cash flow accounting, not accrual accounting.
Mike, so Kim, you're call it accrual,
Yes,
but you're mostly cash flow,
We-
mostly cash.
we recognize accrual.
How
The
much-
only time-
How much accrual, what's the difference in your books? How much accrual do you have?
Our biggest thing is revenues, so we recognize that when the bills go out,
Money's coming in.
but the
No,
money
not when they're
doesn't come
paid, when
in.
the bill goes out.
Yeah, but
but-
the money doesn't come in until 3 weeks later.
Okay, so it's, in your case, it's pretty close. Cash accounting and accrual accounting are pretty close because they're 30 days apart.
Generally within 30 days. Some
But it's
things,
still not money in hand.
Yeah.
That's the most important part. It's
I
not
understand
cash.
that.
some things will run longer, like if we have state involved, sometimes that'll run 60 days, even 90 days.
But a grant doesn't count until it's received.
Correct. So we recognize that grant revenue.
Where this might make a bigger difference, Bob, and it's a great question you're asking, is with capital expenditures.
Mhm.
If if we get a loan from the state, you could have, as I understand it, we could have the money in and not actually start paying on that loan for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So that sort of accrual starts to make a big difference at that point. The last point I want to make is, and again, it's this distinction between accounting and finance. When you're thinking about a business, it's a going concern. And a going concern, the business has to be thought about not 1 year out or 6 months out or a year and a half out. It's got to be thought about as a kind of more of a perpetuity, more of a long-term, entity. And so Richard's been hearing my stupid elephant analogy. So I got,
It's effective.
if you think about the future of the business sort of being a little bit like an elephant, and you have that old parable of the 3 wise men feeling the elephant, and the blind wise men, and each one of them having a different part and seeing a different piece. In a sense, the elephant that we're trying to see is the business as a going concern. It's long-term future. And if your budgeting process is 1 year out,
Mhm.
you've got one little sliver of that ongoing concern.
Mhm.
And it's not enough to make business decisions that will have long-term implications. It's also not enough to see the train in the tunnel long before you have options to sort of, miss it or get missed by it. So now every one of us knows that forecasting the future is incredibly difficult. It's very imprecise, but that doesn't mean that you don't focus on it. There's that old aphorism that you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There is good effort to put what information you do have, as imperfect as it is, in a structure where you can think about it and try to make decisions when you have a lot more options to sort of adjust than if you wait till you're 1 year out and you do a budget and you say, oh my God, what happened? Where did this come from? So there's a big effort in here to formally expand out our viewpoint for a full 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Some areas we're going to be less certain. Some areas we're going to be more certain, but the process would suggest that every year we roll out one more year. 1 year becomes history.
Mhm.
1 year becomes new. And as a group, we think about what those long-term capital projects are going to be. Which ones should we do first? How should we sequence them and so on and so forth. So that was kind of a sort of 5 background points. Does anybody have any?
No, that was very well done.
Okay.
I mean, for me.
Speaking from a finance person.
Well, it was perfect. No, really, it was very, very, very well done.
I think what you're also going to say as well is that because we're talking about utility and lots of equipment, lots of infrastructure, it's even exacerbated, right?
Yes.
Because those things, I think, are planned, or could be planned. Machines, stuff is going to last only so long. There's economic value to it, and there's the actual.
Wears out.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so, but you're talking about infrastructure, like pipes and everything else that goes with all the utilities. I think that could be pretty well understood and planned out.
Yes.
So how are you going to pay for that?
Yeah.
Over time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Okay, if there's no questions, no more questions, let's maybe start on page 2. I want to spend a little bit more time on, we're on the big.
Still are red here, by the way.
I should say, and I did say that we're not, this is not complete.
It's on the back of.
As Kim begins to populate this data, these numbers are going to change dramatically. So do not get, the actual numbers aren't the important thing at
So
this point.
don't look at the red.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe if
Disregard
I-
the red right now.
Maybe if I use that, yeah, Kim seems to be better handling expenses than revenues, but.
Okay, so numbers are fictitious.
Yes, that's right. Well, I mean, they're real, they're just not complete.
Right.
So maybe to use our elephant analogy, what I'm presenting here is the skeleton of the elephant. As Kim fills in the data, we're seeing the skin sort of, fill in. So you've got a pixelated picture here.
Mhm.
It's not that the data is bullshit.
Right.
It's
No,
just
no,
incomplete.
It's incomplete. Okay, so we need to focus on the framework.
Right.
So I have a question. I mean, I fully understand. I remember from earlier presentations you gave that because our product lines, let's call them that, are electric, water, wastewater, and stormwater, and structuring that way. But how in this do you structure, let's just use regulatory impact? So I understand capital. I understand how you would lay that out. I would understand pipes and fleet and all of that. Same thing on the city budget. But this industry is dramatically impacted by third-party regulatory activities. And so my question is, do you put in a reserve for each of your utility lines, knowing, PFAS could throw you in crazy places?
Can we hold that? Because that will come up.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, okay.
That's a damn good question, too.
So let me, I want to spend a few minutes on this page because I think I told you I started out as an economist at Ward Econometrics. And one of the things, we had millions of data series back in the day. And this was in the 80s before people had that kind of data. And one of the things I learned very early on that how you organize data and display data becomes very, very important. So what you'll notice here is there's a data organizational structure that is in every single page. Once you know how to read one page, they all sort of read the same. It's also important to say that humans read left to right, but if you look at a lot of stuff that gets thrown out, the columns are jumbled and you're sort of going back and forth. People oftentimes add, top to bottom. That's the way this structure is. So I think it's important to sort of absorb that organizing principle. So the first thing, what you're looking at here is what's called a cash flow statement. This is, if you looked at any accounting audit and had a cash flow statement, this is what they look like. They come in three major sections. The first section on here is represented by lines 1 through 5, and I'm referring to the lines all the way to the left, the line numbers. We've got them broken out by the 4 utilities, but this is the cash flow from the operations of the organization, from its operating activities. It's the selling of electric and collecting revenues from those sales. It's the selling of water and collecting revenues from the water. It's the day-to-day operations of the organization. So the first section here, you would hope that you would have ultimately, profitable operations, running every day. If you don't, we've got issues that we need to deal with first off.
So just to be clear here, we're talking about cash flow. So this is the general ledger accounting. So electric, we're talking about someone paying the bill. You're reflecting that in the general ledger. That's what's here.
Yes.
And
It's the
this is
basic
cash-
operating
this is
of-
cash. Okay,
And
so
paying
this-
for the electric that they've had to buy to,
Right.
The organization buys the electric and then resells it. So, yeah.
But these are general ledger accounting entries on the system that you're pulling data from.
Yes.
To a point, Calvin, 2023 and 2024 are real live data.
That's what I'm looking at right
Okay.
2025 is the budget. And then 2026 through 2035 are projections.
now. Okay, but that's a different subject.
Yes.
As we get
Yep.
there. So
Yep.
to understand the framework, we'll start with the actuals and then we can go into.
That's right.
That's a different discussion. when We talk about the budget and then the projection.
That's right.
But if you think of it in terms of operating, it is the.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we understand that these are actual for
Mhm.
2023 and 2024. These are actual numbers coming from the general ledger accounting system.
Yes.
Right.
But they're not complete yet, Calvin. So don't, yeah.
They're not the gospel,
Yeah.
but it's where they come from.
But Calvin's point is a good one because in a system like this, you want to have some checks. So if we've organized this correctly, Kim can compare this with the annual audits,
Right.
which are based on
Mhm.
historical
Mhm.
data.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay, the second, so a couple things I want to point out here. Lines 1 through 4 are the individual utilities. We've actually built income statements basically for each one of the utilities.
And you're allocated those costs, this
Yep, and we'll get to that.
overhead and everything has been allocated.
Yes, there's a
Across
section
all-
on that. You'll see.
We have an allocation page.
Yeah, right. I would expect nothing less.
But it's only one so far.
Yeah.
And then line number 5 is, I would call it enterprise level. So it's just the sum of the 4 utilities, so we can see how we're doing at the enterprise.
Is the framework long-term to consider the 4 lines, their own profit centers?
Yeah, so we're going to get to that you'll see that kind of breakdown as we go through
You
here.
guys are really good at this. You already-
The second section, lines 6 through 10, are what are called cash flows from investing activities. So this would be, for example, a company has to invest in plant and equipment. In our case, we have to invest in pipes and things like that. That's an investment that you ultimately want to make profit on or make revenue on. So in a cash flow statement, those types of investments, whether you're buying new businesses, whether you're putting pipes in the ground, or whether you're buying a new building, all show up under this investing activity. It's a really important piece. And in an organization like the Board of Public Works that makes a lot of big capital investments, this is an important section.
Okay, so say these are capital investments.
Yes.
As opposed to other kinds of investments. Financial investments.
That's right. Financial investments. In fact, we had the next section down, the financial activity. But if you were making a finance, the nature of that would matter. So if the financial activity was you were buying equity in, let's say, another utility, but that's a long-term sort of portfolio investment, that would show up under investing activity. That's not what this company does, but if this was a private equity company, that's where it would show up. The final piece would be sometimes you don't have enough operational money to actually fund all your capital needs. So line 5 isn't as big as line 10, as an example. So then you have to go and finance stuff in excess. The finance for an organization like this, maybe you take on debt from the state. Maybe you get a grant from the state. Maybe you issue municipal bonds, or maybe you get a bank loan. That kind of activity would show up here in financial activity. The bottom chunk here is something we've added a little bit additionally, which is we add all these together.
Let's go back to the finance. You're talking about cash flows, and you're talking about when we go to the market and get the money.
That's right. Check in hand. This is the cash flow. Yep. The last chunk, lines 16 through 20, simply adds those all together. Now, it turns out that if we have a red number here in this bottom one, let's say in line number 20 somewhere, that's a real big boo-boo. Because if we have a red number there, that means we don't have visibility on cash flows to handle real costs that we have. In a lot of situations, that puts you in bankruptcy. So that's a solvency issue. So if I was to use this as a decision-making tool, this simple summary page, which takes into account input throughout the rest of the structure, the first thing you go to is this thing at the bottom. And you want to make sure we don't have any reds in there. If we do have a red, then you start to say, well, is it coming from a utility? So we can
So you backtrack.
start to backtrack here. And if it's coming from, let's say, electric, then let's see if we can figure that out. Are we not charging enough? Are we, we paying too much for capital expenditure? Could we move our capital expenditures around a little bit to smooth out, make it even?
Yeah.
It starts to give you options to think about to solve these problems. But the problem we would be trying to solve at this level is red numbers on this page.
Is the BPW philosophy that every utility line should pay for itself long-term? Or is there inherently, like for the city, I know police can't pay for themselves, but I know the building and planning department can. So, and they have to pay for more than themselves to compensate that the police is not a revenue generator.
I
So
think that's an assumption
Right,
that we could probably make, but I don't think it's a policy.
okay.
Okay,
Because
I
I'm,
think
yeah,
that is kind of where people would like to go once they understand
okay.
what it is.
Because, I
But
mean, the framework's
but
great.
it wouldn't be a surprise at this point
Yes.
if one was
Helping the
subsidizing
other.
the other.
Yeah, that would be
His-
great, actually.
Historically, electric has subsidized,
I assume.
Oh, okay.
So
but we would like to move that everything can be healthy by itself.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's the target.
Exactly.
And because that would be, it's not fair.
Yeah.
To have electric subsidizing people
Everything else.
who aren't paying the rate that really should be.
But it's not a
In another-
policy.
It's not a
It's written down somewhere.
Amy, I don't want to get off on the city, but that's an interesting, finance is a puzzle. We're putting together a puzzle here.
Yep.
And what I would say is I'd want to understand the nature of why the police department can't pay for itself. In other words, maybe it's because you're not allocating the police costs to other divisions because they are benefiting from a safe and secure
Exactly.
environment. And
Exactly.
that's a cost allocation issue.
Right, right.
It's not that they're not developing enough tickets or something, to,
No, exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Based on that.
But and that's why where it relates to here is certain entities are revenue plus, and they always will be because they have a source of revenue. Police does have a source with grants, whatever. But you're absolutely right. Part of that's allocation. My point in this is, and I'm sorry to ask it, I'm sure you're getting through it. I'm starting to see as the treasurer of the city that I've got to get more policy commitment because our
Really?
bookkeepers can just, the way you describe bookkeeping and finance, I'd like you to come and give a presentation to council. But the fact is, you got to get that agreement on policy,
Yep.
which this helps generate. Because maybe you don't want every line. Maybe inherently one will
Always be behind.
always be behind, and it's okay because of some intrinsic reasons.
Exactly.
But
One
Yeah.
example of just this last point is stormwater management.
Yeah.
Which has always been kind of an afterthought and
Yeah, out there.
let's see how much let's try this number.
Mhm.
And it's kind of stayed low. But now the third party regulations are hitting stormwater.
Right.
It's coming soon
It's a
Yep.
to a
reality.
neighborhood
Mhm.
near you.
Exactly.
And
Infrastructure like this.
And the expectations of the people.
That's right.
Mhm.
Exactly. Okay.
Okay.
With infrastructure like this, you can make decisions on what to do for strategy purposes,
Yes.
when you have that information.
Yeah.
Without the information, you're just throwing darts.
And
against
the only reason I'm raising the policy side at some point is this gives you the
Yes.
data for the
Ability to
information.
make policy.
To
But
build.
But if one only looked at future finance teams, only looked at the red, they might incur costs for one of the lines that inherently can't afford it. So the tool is here, but the policy has to be in alignment because if not, you'll be raising rates on something
Yeah.
more than you might want
So
to.
Amy's making,
But you have the data.
You have the data, but the data, if you're just red and black, you make
That's
one
fine.
decision. But if you're in your policy, you'd say, it's okay that this is 10% trailing or whatever.
but Amy, you're making, first off, when you go through, to build a model like this, of this level, you've got to really start to really get into the weeds of the organization.
Absolutely.
So and there's positives on that, but I was going to make another comment now, and it was really more apropos to what you just said. No, I can't, now it's out of my mind.
Okay.
Your little moment, I guess. Okay, so anyway, let's go on to page 3.
Before you do that.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that we're talking about, I'm categorizing these things as A, B, C, and D. A being operating, B being investment activities, C being finance activities, and D being.
The
capital.
accumulation of all of it.
No, it's actually A minus B.
That's right.
Plus
C equals B.
Equals the bottom.
Right.
And in fact, the little formulas are right there, if you actually
Yeah,
look at
right
them.
there in the very last one is the formula.
And I actually put the formulas on the front page as well. So you can, and at some point, if you really cared about how this stuff works, you can see how it all adds up.
Well, I noticed that right away with yours.
Yeah. So page 3, so this thing is designed to be like an onion, where you keep peeling and peeling and peeling, and the farther in you get to that onion, the more you're getting at the heart of the situation. So we're still in summary. So what page 3 does, and by the way, I'm not going to take you guys through every page in here, but I wanted to give you enough to get a sense for what's going on. So what we've done in page 3 is blown up page 2.
Mhm.
So where page 2, we have cash flow from operating activities, you might want to say, well, what's that mean? Well, if you look at the top of page 3, operating activities are income from operations plus any changes you have in your reserve balance, your operating reserve balances, plus any changes that you have in working capital. That's how you get,
Okay.
those 3 add up to be operating. Now, what does cash flow from investing activity means? Well, that's any capital expenditures plus any changes in your capital reserves, either positives or negatives. Those add together to become cash flows from investing.
I like that.
And what does cash flow from finance activities mean? Well, that could mean you changed your debt, you took on debt, let's say you have interest payments that you have to make, you got grants, could be bank loans and things like that if this organization begins to take them, and we would have that at the new section here. But those add up to be your cash flows from financing activities.
I love your formulas right underneath it so that you can follow it easily.
Yeah, you go a little batty if you don't have the.
I like it. It's easy to follow.
I used to have a mean math teacher that always was very.
Really?
If
It
you're-
worked,
yeah.
it worked.
So now let's peel the onion one more slice, and we'll go to page 4. What does the first section here, net income from operations, what does that mean? Well, you've got revenues by utility, you've got expenses by utility, and you take revenues minus expenses and you get net income. So we're kind of getting deeper. And then we go on to page 5.
At this point, that's really what the board sees.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's the beauty of the formulas right there. Okay.
Page 5, we understand, as you were going through the cash flow stuff, you'll find that it's not just a reserve pool. We have capital reserves and we have operating reserves. The operating reserves fall into cash flow from operations. The capital reserves fall into cash flow from investing activity. So now we're starting to break up the reserves to try to better understand them. So page 5, the top half is operating reserves and the bottom half is capital reserves. So the reserve model, this is a model within a model. It's a little bit complicated, but I think you'll enjoy sort of going through here because I think this will be
Well, they're all
apropos.
reserves, it's just a breakdown of the
Yeah.
total.
Are they,
But you have to be very careful saying they're all reserves in the sense of each reserve should have a different policy,
yeah,
a different
Uh-huh.
investment guideline.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
They're used for different things.
Mhm.
They have different investment horizons. It's a very different
I
animal.
agree.
So if you just tell somebody, I have $8 million in reserves, that ain't a lot of information to make a business
You
decision
got
on.
that right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
But at least there's no red on this page.
Yeah.
And we do have reserves, by the way. So we're breaking up, first thing we're doing is we're not just saying we have reserves. We're breaking up operating reserves and capital reserves.
Right.
We're going a step farther because each utility has its own reserves policy. So it's not just operating and capital reserves. It's the operating reserves of the electric utility, the capital reserves of the wastewater utility. And so we are accounting in this structure for those different reserves and different policies. And somebody here said this already, but as you go through an effort like this, it becomes very clear that maybe Bob went down this path. Policies almost start to jump out at you. We should have a policy for this, or we should look at that policy to understand how we're, it all of a sudden,
Yeah, it speaks to you.
if we do this correctly, what really should happen is a light bulb should go on. That elephant becomes more visible to us. And the structure of what we're dealing with, making business decisions, becomes clearer and clearer. It'll never be perfect.
No, but at least it'll be.
But it will be-
You can see what it is.
Yes.
Before you go, what are the blue rectangles?
So the blues this is a modeling thing. The blues are assumptions that feed the model. So everything that doesn't have a blue is a formula, and everything that has a blue would be a hard number.
Oh.
That's really for Kim and I, to kind of get this thing sort of seated. Kim will fill in all the blues, and everything else will fill in automatically.
Before we move on page 5, operating revenues is going to pair with cash flow operating activities, right?
Yeah.
And then capital reserve will pair with cash flow from investing activities.
That's right. That's right. They feed in. So if you go to page 6, let's continue. We're peeling the onion for reserves.
Mhm.
It turns out that we have policies on all these reserves, and they create what's called a required reserve by utility. And in fact, we have required reserves for operations. There's actually a formula about that. Number doesn't come out of thin air. There's actually a policy that says you should be able to cover your insurance deductibles. You should be able to cover 6 months worth of expense. There's actually a formula for that. I'm not trying to argue whether that's the right policy or the wrong policy. I'm trying to model this as it is, not as it should be.
And take
That'll
it
be a
from there.
decision for us maybe to review in future meetings.
So are these required reserves established by the board or the regulatory or both?
There's policies that I assume came from a board in the
was board.
past.
All board?
There
But
is a
it was-
policy on some of those things about
All
the
I'm sorry,
reserve.
all board policy or are they required? by-
It's board policy, but it was the guidance of an outside company.
Well, I don't know what that means.
A consultant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's how old?
But is it underlying?
Moses was in the-
Well, it really has to do with
It's
age,
regulatory based. In
doesn't
other
it?
words, there's no
Have to do with
enforced,
how long ago.
it's a recommendation from the
policy?
board. It's not a
Yes.
forced third party.
There's no regulatory agency out there that says anything
No.
about it.
No.
But how old is this? We talking age here?
It's,
Moses,
I think it was
Before
looked at
Kim was
again in 2021 and there was no changes.
So
Okay.
it's a black box then. So we need to get into the black box.
Calvin, I think when this process is done, there's gonna be a whole lit, but poor Richard's gonna have his agenda for the next, I don't know how many meetings, you know.
Exactly.
But anyway, so I wanted everybody on the board to understand, or the committee to understand, there is required reserves, and they are by utilities. So lines 1 through 4 are the required operating reserves for the different utilities, and line 5 would be the total. Lines 16 through 20 are the required capital reserves by
Reserves, yeah.
utility, and so on. So the next block down, let's say lines 6 through 10 are the actual reserves we really have. So you've got a requirement, and then you actually have cash in the bank, cash flow. And then the final lines 11 through 15 are basically actual minus required. So you can see where, red's a boo-boo. We're not meeting policy.
So these are good numbers there.
Are they
Close.
Kim?
Yeah, they're
Is it?
close.
So there's, these are more black than red, so that's good.
Yeah,
But
we're
if you-
doing better with capital than operating.
But if Kim comes to the group and says we have $3 million in operating reserves, but you say, but by policy, we should have 8 million.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're
You
not
know.
doing well, right?
And if Kim says we have, $12 million in reserves, that doesn't give you a sense for whether they're operating or capital. It doesn't give you a sense for whether they're electric or wastewater.
That's right.
It doesn't give you a sense for whether you're meeting requirements or not. This structure is to bring all that clarity, transparency to that.
One of the things that I remember when, on the city side of this, when they would talk about reserves, I always say, what does that mean? Because they seem to be comfortable with just a number
Mhm.
of saying that reserve was 5 million. I said, but what?
Yeah.
In what? What's it for? How are you using it?
It's
What
the
is-
void.
And it's like a black hole.
Exactly.
Piggy bank.
And really, it's your problem. It's the-
Thank you, ma'am.
Congratulations.
It's drive me crazy.
Exactly.
Okay.
Before I get into the details at this point, but some of these numbers, how much of this is fungible? I mean, when you talk about one area having significant reserves, another area a little deficient, but as an entity, got a ton of reserves, right? So
We don't have a ton of reserves.
Well,
We have reserves.
I mean. ton of
No, a
reserves
ton is
with
not a
respect
word
to-
we would use.
With respect to enough to cover whatever the deficiency is in any one of these individually because of the amount that's in other areas.
Well, think about this. So think about this. There's a notion of whether some of the risks, let's talk about operating reserves for a second. Some of the risks,
That's a different area.
some of the risks that you're trying to cover
Right.
are systemic risks that affect everything. So for example, we have a hurricane come through.
Right.
We're probably going to peg out on insurance deductibles in virtually we're going to have to cover insurance deductibles on everything. It's not, well, we got to cover the electric. We could subsidize it with wastewater. There's other things that might be utility specific. The policies are written in a way that each one of these has its own.
Right.
We could have the policy written that they can also, in what conditions could the wastewater pull from the operating reserve of the electric, but that's a policy issue.
Mhm.
And there's not a right or wrong here. It's how, it's how your business works. But what you don't want to do is leave yourself vulnerable to a systemic shock where you just don't have enough reserves.
right,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, you don't want to have have everybody locked in with a policy that the board can't move things.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a policy
If
question.
after the hurricane's
Mhm.
over,
Then what?
this needs more
You know,
help than that.
and I'm sure, Richard, you're doing this, but it seems like a lot of our conversation, we're already into like execution
Yes.
on policy, and maybe we keep a growing list because it's prompted by
But-
things.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so when we start to get to the point, I mean, I know we're jumping ahead and,
Yeah, yeah.
and you're doing the framework, but the framework is so excellent that it actually says, oh, wait a minute, how would we do this? One of the things that I would be interested in is a policy over time. So you don't want a policy that would set or restrict the board in terms of its reserves. That's too tight and not manageable. But long-term is the right answer, but it may take you 3 steps to get there.
yeah.
So letting the board know that once they've decided on the investment policy or the reserve policy for wastewater, that could be their overall, but it's gonna take us a
Time.
decade,
Mhm.
and we're gonna have to revise it every 3 years. Because what I see on the city side is the policy was there, but they deferred outlays. So
Every
the
year.
piggy bank got big, okay, but it's not real. It's not
Yeah.
a real piggy bank. And so I would be concerned for the board of BPW when you increase rates, okay? When someone would say, well, I thought you had, X million in.
Yeah.
But in fact, it needed to be allocated.
Amy, what you just articulated is a common problem with governmental entities because nobody wants to raise taxes, and in order to make the books balance, you can defer
Yeah.
things.
That's what we
And
have
defer
done.
things, you can keep
So
patching the
it's like-
roof
Yeah.
when the roof
Absolutely.
should be replaced.
Absolutely.
And
The city spent $200,000 last year on streets.
Right.
But see,
It's
but I
probably
think-
not enough.
I think the problem is, and one of the problems is, I think people don't have the clarity of the elephant. Decision makers to go stand in front of your
Yes, exactly.
customers or your taxpayers and say, this is why we need to do this. Because if you don't have if you can't see what you're really trying to do, once you start getting beat up in a meeting, you just don't, okay, I get it, we'll back off. But I think if you stood up and said, you put these pipes in,
Right.
and this is what these pipes cost, and, they do wear out over time, and they do have to be replaced, and we got to come up with the funds to do it.
Just work with a group that works with you.
So, Kevin, I know you want to say something, but Richard and I have talked about this a lot. A structure like this, you don't present this structure to everybody. There's pieces in here that would go to the finance committee. There's pieces in here that probably all that goes to staff.
Mhm.
There's pieces of it that go to a board level. Maybe it's even more summary. There's pieces of it that could be used for presenting your needs to your customer base, but it's all here. It's everything you need is here. It's just a matter
It's how
of what
you do
pieces
it.
do you pull out. But if this is what the elephant looks like, it needs to be funded. That's part of that, and that's just the way it is. So I hope this makes people feel more comfortable that have to get perhaps in front of these difficult situations to be more confident in what they're articulating, asking for.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this infrastructure lends itself to a good communication piece and transparency.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. So we can go to page 7. So now you might say, well, what's the formulas? So the operating reserves, we're gonna just play around with this for a minute.
So,
The operating-
I'm sorry, are these good numbers or incomplete? or-
Well, they're incomplete,
Okay, even though they're all black.
but they're getting populated now. So, so first off, operating reserves, we're right above line number 1. There's a formula in our operating reserve policy that we need to have a certain amount of reserves to cover expenses. And how much is that? Well, that's on line 6 through 9. We need to have, the electric utility needs to have reserved in operating reserves 25% of their annual expenditures. There's actually a formula in the policy for that. I'm not arguing that 25 is the right number, but it's the number. And if we go down to the next section, there's reserves covering the historical asset
I'm
base.
sorry, so you have 25, is that number someplace?
That is
It's
based on
line
policy.
6
The
through
second
9.
one,
Oh, no, percentage, but is that relate, is there actually a number rather than percentage?
Yeah,
Well,
that's
so
our
pers-
policy.
Oh, okay, so it's the 670, the first one?
So if you want the actual number, you would say your expenses are 675,000. So I'm looking at lines number 1, 2023 for electric, 765,000
Yeah.
multiplied by 25, which is line number 6, gets you line number 10.
Okay, that's
191,000.
that's what I was looking for.
And in fact, those
Got it.
formulas are all there on the left.
Okay.
So this model would allow the board to say to Kim, and because was there science or art in the 25%? Who knows? But you could say, if we reduced our expense coverage ratio for reserves to 10%, what does that mean to
Exactly.
cover things, right? Okay,
In fact, the power of this structure,
Right.
one of the many, is that it actually allows you to do what ifs,
That's
to
right.
do those exact things.
Yeah.
What if we change it to 50%?
It
What if
gives you a
it's
starting
10%?
point.
yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There's got to be an underlying reason why you picked the reserve. Put some thought to it. It can't be arbitrary.
It shouldn't be arbitrary.
You know, what's the philosophy of having that reserve and what's the purpose? And, you know,
Yeah.
1 year, 3 years, 5 years down the road.
But
And
as a-
why is it always equal to across every single
But
product?
as a
I mean, that would
starting
be the first
point-
thing I would look at is
Golden
This shows
question.
Basically,
what
somebody says you have 3
policies-
months worth of reserves.
that's
Mhm.
right.
Exactly.
That's not uncommon, by the way, for operating reserves. Usually companies will have between 3 months and a year's worth of expenses. And a lot of that would depend on the mismatch of your cash inflows and your cash outflows. You're a company that tends to run with huge amounts of accounts receivable.
Mhm.
You got money going out, when you don't have it coming in, you got to have a lot bigger operating reserve.
How does the finance committee, this
Good
is
one,
policy, how does the finance committee benchmark for the board? I mean, I understand how we can model reserves, you know, you can do it to 10%, 16%, vary it by, but how do you get the data to say, just what Mike just said, you know, I know as a company, as CEO of my past company, I wanted 6 months of reserves. I wanted to be able to keep the lights on and enough time to go figure out more work before I had to shut the place down. That was my comfort level to sleep at night. Okay. But in the utility industry, what is it? So I'm not saying that we do that. I'm not saying we discuss that. I'm just saying, how do you do it? Do you benchmark? You know, how do you know that in the electric utility business, you need 3 months, but in the water, you need 9? I have no idea. But I just think the finance committee should be advising the board, because if not, the board's just gonna pick a number. I don't blame them. Well, you just pick a
So the board
number.
wouldn't know.
Well, so I want to say two things on that. I get really, I think you have to be really careful that benchmarking, because normally what you'll do is you can throw together a peer group that really is not an appropriate peer group.
Sure.
The setting of this is going to have a lot to do with your accounts receivable and how long that cycle is. But what I would say is the first pass here is you try numbers and you're really trying to see, what does it do? Are we meeting our demand? But at some point, Kim may have to model monthly cash flow. Now, these are annual blocks, so this is a little bit of a blurry. For cash flow stuff, she may actually have to do monthlies or even weeklies to understand and make sure we have enough money in the bank.
Oh, I think so.
Mhm.
What is this cash reserves or are you including lines of credit and other things? here?
No, these are just cash on hand.
Cash
Yeah.
on hand.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that comment, Mike, you just said, so Kim, eventually, you have to know how much money you need daily, weekly, monthly, whatever, but probably it's less than a month. You need to know how much money you have. But that doesn't mean it all needs to sit in your investment strategy in a reserve that's hard to get to. So, you know, what I'm trying to get the city to do is say, I don't know yet. Maybe we need 2 million really liquid. But then
The word is liquid.
but maybe we need another 1 million so we sleep at night, and the other 7 goes into long-term. So there are 3 buckets.
Mhm.
And because of electronic transfers now,
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
you can make things liquid
Oh, mhm.
rather quickly.
Mhm.
So, but at least they're invested, at least when they're not being tapped, they're making money for BPW.
So I'll say that we have our operating and then we have our investments. And then we also went and got a line of credit for the OCRAP
Okay.
and to make us sleep better.
That was
Okay,
recent.
That was 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Was it?
Yeah.
Hey, and you have several checking accounts?
We have one big Fulton checking account, but in our GL, you can see what each utility has.
Can you move funds within a minute? In other words, is your investment money related to reserves locked up? Meaning it's got a certain interest rate, you can't, without a penalty, you can't access the funds?
From UBS to Fulton,
Yeah.
from investment, it's usually about a day.
Okay.
That's
So-
good.
So these reserves are invested
Yes,
Yes.
at UBS.
yes,
And your checking accounts make money.
yes. There's a 3% interest that we have with Fulton Bank.
Yeah, I think they saw the investment portfolio, 80% of it's fixed income. isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think we're going to have a section talking about reserves, right?
Right.
The investment. So as far as this goes, so just there's two other pieces that fall into operating reserves: reserves covering insurance deductibles and reserves for insurance, self-insurance.
So what's this reserves covering historical asset base?
What does that mean?
Well, so a company that has a huge amount of think about you in a house. If you get a really, let's say we have two homes here. We've got a $200,000 home and we got a $5 million home. $5 million home is probably a lot more complicated with a lot more stuff. If you were going to hold a reserve on that in case there was a boo-boo that happened to your house, you probably want to hold more reserves for the more expensive home because the roof is going to be more expensive. The Sub-Zero refrigerator is going to be more expensive than the Kenmore and all that stuff. The concept here, and this is a policy, so I'm not, but I think the idea they had here was if you got a lot of assets, there's more possibility of something going wrong unexpectedly in a year, like maybe a pipe breaking under the canal.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah.
That's funny.
One would think.
Right. Oh, that
So
happens.
what is
Hypothetically,
That's
of course.
it. Yeah.
So what is this number? 13 million.
So we have audit, we have a balance sheet, which has the firm's assets on it. And that's an audited
That's our
statement.
Okay,
historic
got it.
value.
I'm sorry, I'm,
It's kind of a resiliency idea.
okay,
Oh, yeah.
because I just don't, I understand the 5 million house to the 200,000, but I don't understand it related to your grouping of utilities. Why is it so critical to have a reserve covering historical asset base? Why isn't it all pulled together? So there's some logic. I mean,
So
resiliency is
when-
one.
When I read it as it was an attempt at a resiliency fund
Okay.
Yeah, look,
for our assets.
the first chunk here is trying to cover mismatches in accounts payable, accounts receivable. That's this first chunk. You just have cash flows that aren't lined up.
Okay.
The second chunk is sort of, now you got this big asset base you're responsible for. A pipe could break underneath the canal. We have to have something to be able to fix that. We don't have that. That's not an expected failure. It's just, you're exposed to that. And then you've got insurance deductibles. All the utilities have their own insurance policies, but they all have deductibles. If you have to pull from that, you're going to have to come up with that chunk of money.
Yeah, I'm just.
And then there's a chunk that's called self-insurance. So there's actually $1 million,
Which is
maybe this is another
solution.
resiliency piece here.
It's to look out for that, right, okay.
But I guess the word reserves covering is throwing me, because you don't have a reserve there. This is actually the asset
No,
on the book.
there's a reserve. So
There is a
in order
reserve.
to do the calculation, you have to know what the historical asset base is. The formula says 2% of that asset base, so lines 20 through 23, have to be a reserve.
I'm looking at lines 15 to.
It's 15 through 19.
15 through 19 multiplied by, so if you take line number 15, 13 million multiplied by
Yeah,
2%,
but what?
the reserve is $270,000.
Oh, okay. So reserves covering. Okay, that's the base then.
So what we're trying to do in this is be very clear about the formula. X
Okay.
times Y equals, Z.
Okay, so if I look at the balance sheet, I'll see electric at 13.5 million.
Yes,
The reserve, the word reserve got me.
Yeah.
That's not the reserve, but.
that's not the reserve. That's
Exactly.
the,
It's really assets.
Yeah.
It's the asset.
Yeah.
It confused me as well. I'm like, I don't understand how you have 13 million. Why are
And
you
use
down to
the-
270? What are
And
you
you're
doing?
using the word reserve, so
Yeah.
So
it does.
the reserve is actually 270, right?
The real reserve is
Yeah.
off an asset base.
Asset, right.
so if you look, all good points, and when you're in this, you don't kind of,
You're in the weeds.
but if you look at line number 10,
Mhm.
right above it, the header is expense-driven reserves.
Mhm.
That is the reserve. Your question as a policymaker should be, how'd you get there? Which is the 6 through 9 and the 1 through 5.
Right.
If you look at
Well,
line
20,
24,
23.
right above it is the historical asset-based driven reserve. I didn't make that name up. That's in the policy.
Hmm.
Where does that come from? Where does that 270,000 come from? Well, it's 2% of the 13 million,
Asset
yes.
base, right.
Then you've got reserves covering insurance deductibles. Where does that come from? Well, those are the insurance deductibles there. That's in the policy. Where does self-insurance come from? Well, there's a policy that we have $1 million sitting in a bank just as general self-insurance. Maybe a pipe breaks under the canal. And you've got, and how big should that be, or how should that be allocated? Well, 10% is paid for by electric, 40% is paid for by wastewater.
Mhm.
That's in the
So
policy.
this is really,
So these are real.
They're real numbers, yeah.
but this is really, I'm just thinking for the board and at some point the public, these are reserve allocations. Like insurance,
Based on our policy.
based on your policy. So you have to keep, in terms on your insurance deductible. In other words, you have to make sure that you have this allocated. If you had more money, you don't put it here. It's just, that's the allocation.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
The only reason I'm saying that, and I know, Mike, you took it from the policy, is at the first read, it looks like lots of pockets of reserves when it's really just how you're allocating off your assets, how you're
Yeah.
calculating. So I just think we're having enough confusion in the labels that probably in the next round, there might be some relabeling. You were forced to use it because you're following policy, but it's confusing. I would be confused as a board. It would look like lots of pockets of
Well, see,
reserves. when
this
it's-
Because of using the word reserve comes
For-
straight down.
I think it's important to say that you're kind of seeing everything here. I don't know that this would ever go to the board.
But the policy does.
The policy does, but at this level, but we have the ability to not go to the board and say we need $7 million in operating reserves. We can actually say we need $7 million because we have some for resiliency, some for self-insurance, some
Correct.
for covering
Mhm,
cash
mhm,
flow mismatches
mhm.
at the, operating level. That's where they come from.
Mhm.
You're
Just don't
seeing-
put this in front of them.
Yeah,
And
and that's
expect
the
them to
decision for
understand.
you, for Richard and,
Mhm.
Yeah, I think what we're saying here is that
Mhm.
because you put these words on a piece of paper, you put a piece of paper, it's confusing right off the bat. And so we're off that tangent and not
Yeah, yeah.
focused on it.
Right.
So maybe kind of more clarity
Yeah.
on the words chosen. Even though-
Absolutely.
That's all we're saying.
I'll let somebody else do some wordsmithing then on that, because I
Yeah.
kind of wordsmithed out myself,
Yeah.
but,
Well,
page
at
8.
the top of page 7, it says operating reserve policy calculation. So I don't know if we bring
the
down the
title.
word calculation
Yeah, I mean,
down, but yeah.
Okay.
we'll let you know that we're confused.
It may also be that if I go through this one time with you, it's pretty clear the next time you look at this, so it's, since it's the first time you guys are seeing it, it's a little bit off. The next page, page 8, is the same types of calculations. It's the policy for where we come up with the capital reserve numbers.
Mm.
And I'm not going to go through this. It's just, this is the stuff out of policy. Page number 9.
Can I ask you, how does the need factor in? Not the allocation, not the money, but how does the board know
When?
the goal, I guess, is like, how much capital do we need? In other words, I understand how this works and I like it very much. It's very clear and I just wonder what drives it. I mean, money can't really drive it. What should drive it is what you need to deliver your services,
I would say that this was designed to be needs-based.
needs-based.
Yeah.
Okay. The reason I'm pausing on that is, and let me just bring it back to the police department, such an easy one. Do we need 17 policemen for our size community? I've got to ask that question because I can calculate 15 or 20. I mean, I can do, that's just
Been there.
math, okay? But so does BPW know how much pipe it needs? In other words, do we know that? Do we know how much a resiliency fund should be so you have a comfort level? This is,
I can answer that categorically, no.
yeah,
We have some ideas,
yeah,
and it's also fair to say that the spectrum of what will change is wide.
Yeah.
I mean, sewage treatment plant
Yeah.
goes or doesn't,
yeah, exactly,
It's-
right.
it's a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's way beyond this, but it's just like, okay, this works.
But to Mike's point, if you at least know where you started,
No, 100%. How can you ever even calculate it if you don't even
you're
know?
better off saying, oh, shit, we need a new sewage treatment plant,
Right.
or we're gonna run this one for another,
Yeah.
you know,
Or you
15
can't
years.
afford this, no matter how we do the math. We don't get
Yeah.
there. Right.
On the page, can you explain, I mean, current year expenditures reserves covering current year expenditures. There's nothing for 23 to 24, it's $10. And then reserve covering future capital expenditures. Where is that number coming from? Do we have a projection?
So
You're
we have
back,
a-
you
we
went
have a
back.
whole capital expenditure model coming, so can you hold that and we'll get to
Okay,
that.
so
It's, yeah, it's pulling
Pages
from
to
another
follow.
sheet, yeah.
And the 15% just blanket
That was
Based on
in the
policy.
policy.
in a policy, just a plain
Yeah.
capital expenditure
Yeah.
policy that says 15% reserve across the board, period.
Now, this isn't to denigrate what's already, somebody might
No,
put
no,
a
no,
huge
no, no.
amount of thought
No, no,
into the
no,
15%.
Sure.
But we're modeling here as
taking
things
what
are,
you
not,
have, right.
yeah, not as
No,
they
no,
should.
Absolutely.
Taking what you have.
Yeah.
We're not criticizing 100%.
Kim, after your drink.
Yeah.
We're getting more clarity.
So I'm going to go quick from here for a little bit. Page 9 is our working capital stuff, which is an important source of operating revenue.
Mhm.
Page 10, working capital is made up of cash and cash equivalents, account payables, and accounts receivables. Page 11 is our debt. Kim and I are probably going to expand this out a little bit more to get more richness in like where the debt actually is. Is it a bank loan? Is it a particular government? Loan,
Okay,
so-
yeah.
What the interest rates are.
Mhm.
Page 12 is grants. That's another source. And here we started, as we get grants, we thought Kim could specifically lay out what grants they are by utility. So we had that accounting, we understood that structure. And then Amy, maybe this gets back to some of your earlier questions. Page 13 is our allocation page. There's 4 different allocations that we're doing here across the utilities. The first is the administrative expenses. Every time we raise Sharon's salary, it really impacts all the utilities.
Well deserved. Well deserved.
Did you get that? Did you get that in the minutes? Anyway, so we have administrative expenses, line number 2. There's the allocation of those administrative expenses, lines 3 for 6. And then there's the actual dollar, the dollars of that, which is lines 7 through 10. So if we take 1.6 million in 2023 administrative expenses and we give 45% of it to the electric utility, they're getting charged and their expense is $765,000.
So these allocation expenses they're like just
The
percentage of
pers-
salaries and stuff.
The percentages were based on revenues a long time ago. And they haven't changed.
These expenses are based on revenues?
The percentage,
No, the percentage. She's talking
so
about
like
lines
the
3 for 6.
45%, 26, 24, 5.
You're asking 2 different questions. He's
Yeah.
saying, where's the 1.6 million come
Oh,
from?
okay.
You're asking
You're-
how they get allocated.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The 1.6 is rent, Kim's salary, Robin's, and so all these the kind of general managers of the organization.
Yeah.
That all adds up to that number. Somewhere years ago, somebody set up a policy to say you're going to allocate them in these percentages.
Oh, so that's just arbitrary at this point?
It just hasn't been looked at for a while. So there's another policy.
It's tradition.
Yes. It
Okay,
should be.
so we don't know what these 40, it's just 45%?
It was based on revenues probably 10 years ago,
Okay.
15 years ago.
So that's something to look at.
Yep.
So Calvin's
And-
kind of alluding to this, but this structure, all of a sudden, you're no longer in here, did we follow this policy? Did we follow that
Mhm.
policy? Now you're sort of saying, is that the right policy?
And
Should
how
we look at
old
that
it is.
policy? Yeah. It's not that we dot the i's and cross the t's, but
Yes.
what should they actually be?
The reality.
Right. The second section down, it turns out that all the utilities, each individual utility uses electric for survival. So the water utility has to run water pumps and things like that. So the way this works is the electric utility buys electric from DP&L or whatever, DMAC. And then we can charge out that electric to the individual utilities. So
Mhm.
usage, line number 15 through 18, those are the kilowatt hours that are used by the individual utilities.
Mhm.
I don't know if it surprises anybody, but the wastewater utility is by far the biggest user of electric.
Yep.
And then we can charge, there's a rate to that, the commercial rate. The reason we're doing that is because the city charges something called in lieu of franchise fee on the sales of electric to the utilities themselves,
Right.
including the electric utility. But, so we've organized it this way. So we're going to show you income models in a few minutes for each one of the utilities. They have an expense line, which is the electric, the electric charge that they get. And this is where that comes from. The next chunk down is we have three water utilities. You've got wastewater, drinking water, and stormwater. They share the same employees. So this is, line 24 is the salaries and benefits of those employees. Line 25 is the actual number of employees. The employee cost multiplied by the number of employees gets you down to line 26, which is the employee total cost. Lines 27 through 29 are the allocation of those costs across the three different utilities. Now, Kim would say here, there isn't a policy, but people are supposed to be putting in their hours,
based on what
time
they're working
sheets,
on.
and that.
Okay.
And the last shared expense here is something called plumbing inspection fees. And Kim, you can talk about those.
So we have someone going out doing plumbing inspections. It's water and sewer. It is 25% of the building permit is what the customer gets charged, and 70% of that gets paid to the inspector. 30% we keep as revenue. With that 70% that we pay the inspector, 60% of it goes to the water utility as an expense, and the wastewater gets 40% of that. So this is in here to show the breakup of it. And, like we've all alluded to, as we've gone through this, it's brought up more questions of how things should be done. Like, I never realized that all the revenue goes to water, but expenses get split between water and wastewater.
And is it
And the outside guy that does the inspection is one guy.
It is one person doing
How
it.
much we paying him?
A lot.
and is it based
6
off?
figures.
70%
6
of
figures.
It's a couple $100,000.
I think last year was I want to say 165.
again, it's all based off of the building permit. So
the city
whatever
building permit or the
the
county?
building,
Yeah, but
the
we're
city
paying-
building
Yeah.
permit.
Maybe we could find, somebody who
Happy medium here.
Correct, you end up with a $200,000 home compared to a $1 million home.
Right.
Yeah.
Same inspections,
Yeah,
Right.
but on the
Different
other hand,
price.
maybe there's somebody
that
else
way.
who might want to do that work for us.
Yeah, really.
Exactly.
I mean, if it's the same.
I mean,
Also, pay really close attention, that's the biggest increase that I'm putting into the city budget, is building permits. Because we don't have any opportunity with all these developers to, years ago, maybe the city could have put something on it, but there was a lot of pushback, as you know. And so Khalil and I have actually gone to talk to the developers, and so it's in the building permit.
God.
So we have 500 plus new properties coming in, and then the rest is just renovation. But watch that in our deliberations, or else, because that is, I don't know if it's gonna pass, but I'm saying, sorry, we gotta take,
if it goes from 2 to 5%.
it's a big impact for you.
But
Yeah,
you gotta go there.
and we're like doubling to tripling. I mean, we're
Yeah.
really looking at a significant change in building permits to cover the reality of our costs.
Yep.
So that's gonna be a big number for you.
Don't
guys.
sign any 5-year contracts with that plumbing.
Yeah, don't sign
inspector.
any 5-year contracts, right? And certainly no, unless they're fixed price, then you might save.
Okay, so we're going to jump to page 14, but before we do that, if you could go back to page 3 for a second. I'm sorry, page 4.
Four.
Look at line number 1 for 2024. You'll see there's an $11,400,000 revenue number. Now, going back to this onion analogy, the first question you should ask is, where did that number come from? Well, if you go to page 14, and you look at line number 9, under 2024, there's that 11,406,000.
Okay.
Okay, so now you say, okay, where did that come from? Well, that was the sum of electric sold to residential customers, commercial customers, and industrial customers, plus something called a demand charge, which is on industrial clients, and then something called ready to serve fees, and then impact fees. And those all add up to be the revenue for that is the revenue for the electric utility.
Kim, one of the things that we're doing on the city budget, that's a perfect example is, so on page, what was that, 4? that we went to? On page 4, we would have a footnote to say, see page 14, so you understand it, because just, it's so challenging if you're not in the weeds on this to know
Yeah.
where you're supposed to
Yeah,
go.
where you're supposed to
And
go.
that has been helping, I think.
So this is an Excel file. Can I click on page 3 or 4 and drill down to?
You sure can. You'll see there. That's what she's doing there right now.
Okay, so dynamic. That's spreadsheet then.
Yes, it's you change this number, page 4. Change you change a number in line, page 14.
Yeah, if I click on page 3 or
Yeah.
4, can I
Well,
drill?
there's-
Will a pivot table bring back? are these
Where it's
pivot
flowing
tables?
from.
No, they're not pivot tables.
But if you click on 11, will it bring back this page here? The detail?
Yeah, so click on 11 there, Kim. So there's the
Click on the,
EUI is electric utility, page 1,
oh, no.
which is page 14.
Okay, I was thinking that you would click on that and this page would show up.
No.
Okay.
Can I just ask you an assumption on page 14? I know we're not really looking at data.
Yep.
I'm not worried about the red, because I'm hoping that's not gonna stay, but everybody is, but on number 8 on impact fees, why is the trend moving all over the place? Like, it's not up or down, it's very variable.
Are you on page
Depends on
14?
how
I'm on
many-
page 14, line 8.
Like,
How many
impact fees.
houses are coming in to pay that impact fee to the connection?
Okay, so I would just question like, it's a lot less, then it really drops,
Mhm.
and then it goes back up in
Don't-
2030.
I want to tell you right now, don't spend too much
Don't
time
spend-
on it.
okay.
Now you're going to go batty, and this is
Okay.
not ready for that stage.
Okay, yeah, okay.
But so page number 14.
Mhm.
Now the next thing is, well, where do those revenue numbers come from? And by the way, the historical stuff that's going to be in the system. But when you get to budgeting and then the 10-year projections, you got to go into forecasting. So we had to build a forecasting model to sort of think about this.
Right.
Are you on-
So that's on page 13. I'm sorry, page 15. All right, now I'm getting my page numbers off here.
So how are you forecasting?
So first off, I'd like to say there's 1,000 different ways to forecast stuff. You can use time series analysis, econometric analysis, cluster analysis. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. We have chosen in here to build what I'll call a structural model. And what we're doing here, so let me give you a flavor for how this works. The revenue on what you get from selling electric is based on what's the markup relative to what the utility has to pay to get the electric in, multiplied by how much electric is used. So kilowatt hours times your markup is your. So what we're doing here is we have, I wonder, no, I don't have enough here in impact fee. I was going to, maybe to Amy's point, I was going to hit that for a second. So the electric rate markup was on line number 9. And let's look at 2024. So there's a 5-cent markup.
Mhm.
If you multiply that by the actual, you add that to the actual fee that the utility pays, and let's, I don't know, what is 8 cents or something like that. So we're charging 14.
We're not gonna-
It's more now,
Okay,
but.
just basically, so we pay 10 cents to get the electric in, we charge 15 to residential customers. So you take that, you multiply that by how much, the total number of usage, which for residential is on 29, it's 33 million kilowatt hours are being used. And so you have to, basically you're taking the price, how much you charge for a kilowatt hour to residential customers, which is different than what you charge to industrial customers. So we'll just keep it on residential. It's how much you charge for a kilowatt hour to a residential customer multiplied by how much kilowatt hours are used by residential customers. But the forecasting is a little bit trickier because when you go into the future, you've got to come up with how many kilowatt hours residentials are going to use. Well, we have a growing community here, so we're going to have more residential customers 5 years from now than we do now. So Kim actually has to put in here some estimate of change in meters. So line number 17 is the change in meters, the growth in meters per year in residential customers. Line number 20 is the actual residential meters. So if you looked at, let's take the approved budget line, the first grade line, we have 3,529 residential meters. Kim is expecting that they're going to grow, there's going to be 50 new meters in 2026, at which case we'll have 3,579 meters. Is that residential meters? Is everybody seeing that? And if you look at line 26, we're forecasting that we're going to use 10,026 kilowatt hours per residential meter. So the individual residential meter usage, multiply the number of residential meters, gets you the total amount of usage, which is the 35 million kilowatt hours, which is line number 29. Then you say, well, I use 35 million kilowatt hours. I got to multiply that by how much I charge for that. And that gets you that's your revenue for residential sales.
Yep.
Does that make sense? I'm not articulating this as fluidly as I would normally like.
No, but you did pretty good.
It was
No,
very
so,
clear.
so the 4.5 million is 33 million times 0.05.
Well, they're in different units. The usage are in kilowatt hours. The revenues are in dollars, but it's basically if you took the cents we charge multiplied by the number of kilowatt hours used, you
Yeah,
get
that's what I'm trying to do. What's 5 cents times 33 million?
well, it's more than 5 cents. It's 5 cents is the markup over
Oh,
what
it's
we pay.
15.
Yeah.
I get it. Oh, okay, got it.
And we all know that,
So not the market.
just as you said in the very beginning, like out years are out years.
Yeah.
But where you're potentially too conservative really would impact, like, it doesn't matter if you're off by a little, but like, and I'm not focusing on that, I'm focusing on the process, that's a place where we should really look at how the policy is, how conservative do you want to be? Like, this projection in terms of number of households is, way under what I would anticipate is happening on the building permit side. So just cautioning that when the model is based on a growth potential, and if the growth potential is too conservative,
You're already in trouble.
you're already in trouble because you're either pulling from reserves or you're
Yes.
increasing rates beyond what you really need,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Not that there's a perfect, who knows for 2030, but I think within the first, this is why in the city, I'm saying a 3-year budget and a 2-year forecast.
Thank you.
But here we go, though, where you have to, this concept that I said earlier on, where you have to take data and create information out of it. So for example, you could say, look, in our operating area, we have, I'm going to pull up bullshit numbers here. We got 500 more lots.
Mhm.
Then the question is, how do you allocate those lots over time? Are they all brand new homes in 1 year, or do they get spread out over?
Right.
We can process that data and create some level of information about it. Another beautiful thing here is if all the available building lots still to go are only 5%, and I don't know if this is the case, are only 5% of what the existing already is, I wouldn't stress so much over, what year they might fall in, because at the end of the day, the total revenues are largely going to be driven by the installed base, not in the new stuff that's coming.
Right.
The other thing is, every year, I am sure the average electric kilowatt hours used by a residential meter goes up and down, but I bet it doesn't go up and down much. A little hotter summer, maybe it goes up a little bit more, air conditioners will run a little bit more. A little cooler summer, it goes down, but it probably bobs around, a general. But we probably have a pretty good idea what it's going to be.
Of course, you have more EVs coming on board. You'll have
Well, that could be. So maybe we do see, maybe if we're tracking this, we do slowly see the usage going up. Maybe the houses are getting bigger.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of replacement houses going on.
Yeah. And I noticed that the markup is pretty constant. I mean, that's probably okay for projections at this point, but I only see like a 5 cent markup pretty much across the board for the next 10 years.
Yeah, so a couple things here. You okay if you look like you're about ready to say something? The utility doesn't do the rates. They have a consultant that does rates and gives them rates. The consultant would like to do no more than 3 years forward look. I think sometimes we ask for 5 years, but then the process only happens every couple of years. So 1 year you might have 4 years worth of projections. The next year it's down to 3. The next year it's down to 2. Then you're only 1 year out. Then you ask for another consultant thing, then you're back out. So
Yeah.
there's no consistency in that.
Mhm.
There also has not been a process or a structure for the staff to assess the recommendations of the consultant
Mhm.
or to challenge, have a framework to challenge the consultant, which is a different structure than the consultant's using.
Mhm.
And so we all have to remember that because you use a consultant doesn't mean you abdicate your responsibility
Sure.
for the decision.
I
You
hope
still
not.
made the decision.
Yeah, really.
So this structure hopefully is going to allow a lot of different things, but one of the important things is for Kim to better challenge and better assess what she's getting from the consultant himself.
Exactly. You're only gonna do what you tell them to do. If you don't tell them to do it, they're gonna roll their own way.
Well, I have a lot of experience with consultants in
I
the
used to
investment
be
field.
one.
Yeah, a lot of them tend to, not you, Carolyn, but a lot of them like to make things much more complicated than they really should be. So I don't want to go down this path at this stage, but the electric consultant has something called a purchase power cost adjustment on electric. They don't use markups.
Hmm.
I modeled this as a markup.
Mhm.
The purchase power cost adjustment, I spent hours on their spreadsheet. I can't understand what they're doing. And I'm pretty good on spreadsheets and modeling and things like that. So
It's designed that way, by the way.
that's my point. And so I think at one point, and I don't know the right group, I think we should have a discussion with the consultant, but I think a markup concept, whether it's 2 cents above or 3 cents above or 4 cents above, it's a much simpler way to think
Yes,
about the problem.
Yes, yes.
And that's a discussion for another time. I just wanted to give you a flavor
Right.
that the forecasting models are basically trying to say, you know, what's our installed residential meters? How much do we think they're going to grow over time? How do we process the data on the available lots that are still left? You know, it's got everything in it that we need to follow to come up with the revenue numbers. So it builds up.
And it keeps the ability of making what if scenarios rather quickly and efficiently to see, okay, how does this work? How does that work? That can help the decision making in many different ways. And in a discussion, negotiation with a consultant of, hey, here's what we've got. This is our information. It's factual, it's transparent, and your suggestion that we change a rate to A, we think it really should be C. And here's why. And here's the data and the visual presentation as to why C is a better result than what you seem to be suggesting. It empowers the staff to have much better conversations.
It always empowers when you do your homework.
I think going forward, and this is all good stuff. I know Mike has spent years doing this. Me too. And along with the staff too. But from a governance and oversight perspective, I mean, I could see from a strategic perspective, taking this information, and BPW has a market, I guess a market area right now, right? I mean, in its charter. I mean, how big is that? I mean, how far can it go outside? Its
2
current
miles, say
footprint.
no.
The concern is that the city of Lewes is finite, right? There's only so many lots here.
Unless we annex, yes.
And so we're talking about this infrastructure. I mean, to be a viable company, does it have to expand? outside and grow its market area? And what does that look like? And
You would only want to do that if you have economies to scale. It's not clear that expanding is actually lowering costs.
That's a good point.
And it's structures like this that help you think about that very question. That was one of the things I questioned early on, which is, do we want to expand? But you can't make those decisions unless you have a pretty good idea of what it's going to do to your economies of scale. Companies can overexpand, and it's a big problem. It can be a big problem.
Sure.
In the public markets, it's always growth, 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 growth.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes what you want to have is profitable growth. We had an entire tech sector that blew up in the late 90s because it was all about growth and not about profit, or not about. That's why all those little tech companies. That's why we had the dot-com crumble. So you're asking the right question. What we're trying to do is have a framework here to help us sort of ask those help add information to answer those exact types of
I
questions.
guess my comment is that once we have this information, I'm not sure what committee, what oversight group takes this information and begins to start thinking about strategies. I mean, is that the board, or is that some other committee that talk about, okay, this is good
Where to go
information.
from there, you mean?
What do we do with it short term, long term, from a growth perspective?
And you finished your
Well, I
strategic
think
plan? I know Patrick came in and his company worked with
Well,
you.
the strategic plan doesn't touch this.
It doesn't
Yeah,
touch the
exactly.
expansion, okay.
Exactly.
And I think what's gonna happen is we'll get through an iteration or two of this, and we'll say, we have, 50 projects we ought to take on, is this committee and some others, and we'll take on the first 3
Mm.
Okay.
and start. But I don't think that, we're gonna have the capacity to build address it all.
Right.
We'll address
I'm
those that are
I'm just suggesting
crucial,
this. Yeah.
important, or
But that might be an
rough
interesting thing that the finance committee came forward to the board to say, there are 3 areas we recommend you either empower us or somebody else to.
Yeah, I think it'll be that.
So, because we're coming just from a financial.
And I
hat.
think
Mhm.
that
It needs to be broader.
there
By
ought to be
charter,
some,
don't we have the ability to go out 2 miles beyond the city limit in certain circumstances?
Yeah, and again, in the electrical side of it, most of the service area is already divvied up from the electric side. Water and sewer, there's what they call CPCN areas. Some of them are already designated to Tidewater, some of them to, I don't know, Artesian, to the county from the sewer side. Some of them are still open. So if the board decides, okay, we want to serve, you go out New Road past, Capes Cove. We just got the CPCN for Capes Cove. There's another Tidewater or Tradewater. It's a little,
Yeah, the development on the left.
they're, I think, undetermined yet. So the thing about the CPCN area is the residents have to request to be put in. We can go ask, it's not, if we want to go out in these undesignated areas, we can go ask and say if we want to or not. I guess the same thing was brought up when they talked about Oyster Cove years ago. Darren was here before and he felt it was great for us to supply the sewer out there. But that's all we do, just the sewer. And it's off of Old Orchard Road.
Mm-hmm.
But that sewer, the development is ours, but the pipe runs to a lift station that the county owns. So it's kind of, do you want to continue to take that on? Again, and Tidewater have certain areas coming in on New Road. So we're kind of limited. Yes, we do have the right by the chart. I think it says 2 miles, but it's not just cut and dry because some of that area might already be designated to someone else.
or Tidewater might make him a better deal.
Correct. That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Some of them, again, and I think it was a little harder years ago when the city required to be annexed.
Mhm.
or a pre-annexation agreement if we supplied them water or electric.
Right.
Now, that's not the case. It's, okay, if you want to, yes, we would like for you, but it's not a requirement.
Right.
So it does make it a little easier, but then you get into the out-of-city rates, and that's just another.
We talked about strategy before. I still think, we probably didn't have a conversation with all this good stuff, because I'm thinking that, one, what's competition? I mean, are we, as a competition, rates can be much less than? Like that, right, and you're done, I think.
Yeah.
But, strategically, someone's got to think about these things as we grow and continue want to be a
Yeah, there need
viable
to be
concern.
growth scenarios. There do, absolutely. On page 15, when you were just talking about the markups, I
Yeah.
just want to go back to the consultant, and I don't know where you are in the procurement or whether, that person's 2 years in. But I think the point here is that simplified, quote, simplified markup strategy is something you'd want your outside vendor. You want them to use the same framework, or their framework will be a black box for you to compare. So you could amend a scope, or you could reissue a contract. But I would think you want your outside vendors, once you adopt this framework, you want your outside vendors to be working within it so the data is comparable, so that when you get it as staff, you can say, why are you suggesting a 7-cent increase markup?
I agree with that. I believe Kim has actually asked them about taking a markup framework, and Austin, when he was here, was amenable to it himself
Okay.
as a way to price the business.
Okay.
But Kim, what pushback did they give you?
That's not, that, power cost adjustment is the standard norm and not a markup.
Yeah, so don't
And so-
question that. It's the standard norm.
Yeah.
Oh, well then.
Oh, that's it, huh?
Find a new vendor.
Yeah, that's the gospel.
Exactly.
According to who?
Yeah,
Got the answer.
you got the answer.
They didn't have a real answer of
Yeah.
why. It's just, that's the way it's been done
We've
by all
always
of
done
them.
it that way.
Yeah.
Those
Well,
all
you're
the
the client,
utilities.
so they need to be your framework. Yeah, I hear you.
You can usually take the dollar sulfur.
Yes, sir.
Well, Kim also knows that there's a reduction, right?
There's
The
gonna be
Indian,
4%.
we raised
But
rates on electricity by
10%.
10%, and we look like we're gonna get some of that back.
So the reduction that's coming is unrelated to Indian River.
Okay.
So we're gonna get a 4% decrease due to better auction terms, market prices, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's this whole other big thing sitting out with FERC, which is the Federal Energy. It's a government entity that looks over the energy
Regulatory
markets.
Commission.
Yeah, and they, with Indian River, the connection was done 22 months earlier. So in theory, we should be not paying anymore. However,
We are.
how long is it gonna take for the FERC courts to decide that? And how are they gonna do it? Are they gonna gradually stop our payments and then give us credits back for what we overpaid? Are they gonna completely stop our payments? When is that gonna happen? We have no idea how it's coming.
Or should we keep the 4% and not tell anybody?
That's a serious question.
Yeah.
I mean, because you have or do we have enough, our reserve, we're under reserve. Do we have enough for capital expenditure?
Fortunately, Kim is tied closely as one of the administrators, if you will, of DMEC, and has access to late breaking news.
No,
Federal Energy Regulation Commission.
Commission.
There it is.
All right, so page 16 is the last in the electric utility. This is the expense model. We just went through a revenue model.
That's our, good for you jumping in. We have 41 pages. Have we gone for
No, we're gonna, one more after this, and that'll be it. But quit asking questions.
Fair enough.
I'm getting hungry.
Exactly. Come on,
Reason why I asked.
I was gonna say, yes, this looks great.
Are we gonna take a break and all get lunch?
Yeah, come back. So page 16 is the expense model. So every utility, we build a revenue model and an expense model, and that's how those numbers come up. The expense model, if you look at lines 13 through 21, those are the expense categories that the electric utility generates. I won't bother going through where they come from, but the administrative stuff came off that allocation page I showed you earlier. The electricity sold, that's the dollars in the electricity sold. Turns out we actually lose almost 3% of electricity in transmission. It's not somebody stealing it at the line. It's, I guess, maybe Robin knows. I don't know if it's heat generated and, but we have to pay for it. We just don't get to sell it. Then there's the electric utility used by the electric used by the electric utility itself, line number 16. That came off the allocation page. The in lieu of franchise fee, some miscellaneous expenses, professional services, repair, maintenance, and salaries and benefits. So that's where the $9,900,000 in expenses for the electric utility came from. Each utility has its own revenue model and its own expense model. They all allow for what ifs, they allow for changing rates and things like that, and you can see what happens. If you want to add 2 more employees, you can pop them in here and see what that's going to do to the structure.
this little franchise that goes to the city, is that 5% of revenue? Is that
2 to 5%.
But we're charged right now 5%.
Yes.
Right?
So does that make any sense? Actually?
Policy.
It's charter.
It's in the charter.
It's charter, not policy. I mean,
Right, yeah.
but it's the same charter wording that the city has for their charter.
So last page, I promise, page 39. After we get through all the revenue and expense models, we have capital expenditure models. And each utility has its own model. By the way, Richard has done a really nice job sort of kind of laying out a table of contents if you actually want to find this stuff. But this 10-year push, try to understand this, shows up in this type of structure for each one of the utilities. It lays out each individual project, the expected cost and the expected time that it will be taken on. This is the kind of stuff that actually feeds the investment section of the cash flow statement. So it all, you change a number here, it ripples through the whole thing. It allows you to compare them against your capital reserves. Do you have enough reserves to cover these costs, or you're going to have to go out into the government or markets to get loans? But each individual project is timing and whatnot. It's laid out for every utility. So very transparent. Everything can be sort of found in this package about where it comes from.
And these have actually been updated, but they're going to be updated again after our meeting with G&D that we have on Friday.
So one of the things that concerns me about a consulting model is that consultants, just by the nature, just never see the whole elephant. They see bits and pieces that they think they need or will want to do their particular role. But this is a structure where we can put the whole thing together. For example, I don't know if our rates consultant knows that we're under reserved and that one of our policies should be getting our reserves up when they come up with rates.
I guess they do know because they want us to finance everything.
Okay, well, that's another issue.
Yeah.
Do we want to take loans for all these capital expenditures, or should we be building capital reserves to fund them? There's a big difference between the two. If you're building capital reserves up, you're charging current users who are wearing the equipment out for the equipment they're wearing out. If you take loans, you're charging future holders for all the equipment that was, so it's,
Worn out by the other.
and there's a Venn diagram, there's an overlay of those two, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
And if you're sharing stuff across utilities, the composition of the water users is not the same as the competition of the electric users. There's a Venn diagram, but they're different. And so, these are all kind of interesting questions and decisions that come up in here. But back to a point I made at the very beginning of this, every single business decision that you make shows up in this package. It shows up in the financial structure of the organization, the financial position of the organization. Policies fall out of this thing, just working on this, you got 10 or 15. First thing you ask is, where did that policy come from? Why are they doing it? And the question is always, the answer is always, well, that's the way we always did it. Somebody did that years ago. It was a consultant and they said, that's the norm. This gives us an opportunity now to start really asking questions and challenging those things.
Well, I think it's great.
That's great.
I would say one thing, Kim has heard this before, is all those numbers ought to be divided by 1,000 so you can read them.
Oh, I'm sorry, you hear that.
In our world, $20 million, 1% is 200,000. 10% is 20,000.
Right.
I agree with that. The one concern I would have is some of these numbers are small. And so there all of a sudden be a lot of zeros on here. But they're not immaterial. Well, you have to remember though what this is used for. You guys may never have to see this whole package again. The committee's going to have to determine how much it wants
needs to exist down to the $109. But, it doesn't need to be, this group doesn't need to know that it was a $109. It needs to know that it's, because the big stuff that's going to come at us is, stuff like we're going to need a new sewer plant. They're gonna ignore this PFAS stuff, or they're gonna implement this PFAS stuff. And those are millions.
Just for an estimate for PFAS treatment was $16 million.
Yeah, but I think it's at least pushed out 4 years.
I think it was 3 years that we would be starting.
Well, I think
We
he's
are
something- I
applying
think he's
for
some-
grants, though.
I think
I
he's
think
doing
since
something
last
else.
week. It's now 7.
So
It's really more than four.
when you use a model, in a lot of the areas I've experience in, use of models requires validation, right? Especially when you talk about decision-making or decision-making, models are very scrutinized by regulators. So you've done this, just Excel model. As you comfortable? Would you like someone to come in and validate this stuff here? I mean,
Well, there's 3 validations in here that happen. 4 validations. One is the forecast become history, come live data at some point. So you kind of had a validation if you're way off, right? You got something going on.
Right.
The second validation here is that we have audited statements every year. So several of these columns, the historical columns, are organized around a cash flow statement. So that can be validated through the audit. If we're way off in the way we structured this, the audit numbers and what's coming out of here are going to be way off. The third thing is we have consultants that we use. The consultants have a different framework. So if their results are very different than what we have coming out of here, it could be they made a mistake, we made a mistake, or something in between. But that would be a third validation. The fourth validation is you guys are actually, we collectively are approving a budget. There's a structure in here where every quarter, or whatever the time frame we choose, we are updating live data during the fiscal year and comparing it with the budgeted numbers to see whether we're way off or not. So that's kind of 4 validation points. I don't know of any other way of doing it, at least that I'm familiar with. It's a cash flow process. That's a FASB structure. It should be compared to audits and things like that.
I think you have Kim and Robin and others looking at this stuff all the time, the basic information that is you know, that's real, and monthly expenses and stuff like that.
If you go to a big company, UBS or UPS or, pick your, Avis Rent-A-Car, pick all those guys use a structure or systems like Oracle or SAP. They're more than an accounting system, but they can build structures like this. They wouldn't build this structure. This is organized around the way that this company thinks about its business. But to run those types of systems in the big companies, they actually have they actually have staffs. These are living documents. Every time they change a price or they create a new line of business or they change their geographic, somebody is in there reprogramming the Oracle system. And these are monstrous undertakings. I'm not real happy, to be quite honest with you, using Excel as a production tool. I love Excel as a development tool. That has nothing to do with the actual way it's put together. But to use it as a production tool, it does worry me a little bit. I just don't know an easy way around this. I built something like this for the Children's Beach House. I was their board treasurer, and I'm their board VP. But we are just now moving to a new accounting system there. And we believe that the new accounting system can be customized to basically produce, it's not at this complicated level. That's not a validation, but it's a way to maybe possibly replace Excel as a tool. But now you can actually go to somebody and say, here's the way we want to look at this. It's not, you're not having a nebulous discussion about,
Sure.
Can you produce a cash flow report? Which is, you're actually saying, look, this is the way we look at our business. Pipe size matters for the water. We need to understand the loss in electric. We need to, the number of houses that are using electric is an important thing because it impacts impact fees and things of that sort. So I don't know if that's not really what you're asking, but one possible movement to this would be to somehow figure out this can be automated or at least taken out of Excel and put into something else.
All I'm saying is that we're going to use this to make decisions, right?
Yeah.
So if there's an error here, we made a wrong decision based on the error.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
So, and you all worked really hard on this. It would be nice to have some validation, say, hey, this is great. We don't see any errors here. This is working as intended. I understand from a Stoker perspective, you get a lot of data from the general ledger system, so it should be pretty close. But is there something more that we should be thinking about and doing to validate the model?
Well, an obvious candidate would be the auditing firm.
Well,
Some
you
other
just-
part of it, not the auditors, but
Were you just ordered? Have you been ordered?
I can reach out to the auditors, but they generally deal with historic, not future.
They're not gonna come in and
But-
help you.
But I mean, they could know somebody or
I think auditors also have a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
They're not here
Yeah,
to tell you what you should be doing.
Right.
They're here to say, if this is what you say you're doing, we're going to make sure.
Make
that's
sure
what you're
that
doing.
that's what you're doing.
So you'd have to hire a different auditing firm, but it could be.
and they're-
Yeah, but most other companies have a
that's
consultant.
how they all got
They're
consultants.
separate and apart from the accounting folks. People, the CPAs who come in to the books.
I think Kim knows, right? I mean, one of the question is, how do we, if you had somebody check the forecasting models are the tricky. Most of this is fed by those forecasting models, the income statements.
Or maybe get some college kid to come in.
I mean, we
Some
do
whiz-
work
some
with
whiz
University
kid
of Delaware.
in
IT.
I don't know if they have.
I don't want to be arrogant, but there's 40 years worth of knowledge in this. You can get a kid out of college to build this, you better hire him right away.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's already above
Yeah.
where he should be.
He's dropping out.
I'm sorry about that.
I'm not talking about
Tech firm.
I'm talking about the actual.
That's it.
I'm talking about what the-
It's
what
the
we
same
need to-
as the city.
It's a stupid thing.
So-
Yeah, we need to do this versus actually.
That's actually gonna be a discussion for future.
So don't take that wrong.
Okay. One of the things that because, so it's the same as the city, so you have to pass your FY '25 budget by March.
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to, I've been looking at Fairfax County, Virginia, and a few other organizations that model very transparent budget processes. Like this one is very transparent that you put together. And what I've been seeing is a narrative to go with budgets. So it's not just numbers, because not everybody understands numbers.
Amen.
But the narrative, so I just drafted one, we'll see how it goes in the
The
city
more words
council.
you have, the better off you are.
Right, so I have a 5-page narrative of the budget that council is looking at the next 2 weeks. And it says, here are your revenue sources, here are your expenses. Here's the philosophy of, for example, we're not touching operating reserves in this round. We're gonna use every dollar of transfer tax. So that's a shift for the city. So I'm laying down the financial philosophy, and then I'm adding a part, when you approve this budget, this is what you're giving your customers. So you're giving them a design for Schley, you're giving them these number of capital projects. I'm hoping in this, because what I saw in Fairfax that I liked was when the governing bodies are deciding, they're actually knowing what they're buying. So a budget are numbers, and some people are just not good numbers people.
That's right. That's right.
So I'm testing it. We'll see in 2 weeks whether they like it or not. I know many of them are fixated on the worksheets right now, and I'm like, just hang in on the Microsoft
The more you
Word
take the
document.
numbers out of the
Yeah.
way and you put
Because
it
if
into
they
verbiage.
disagree with the concept, I mean, then I don't, the spreadsheets are everything else. So it's like this. I mean, I think what you're asking us, the finance committee is, we are in agreement that this is a framework that is very valuable for decision making.
Yeah.
That's really what we're telling the board,
Right.
right?
Yes,
That's the main
yes.
thing. The numbers, everything else, the variables change, but here's your framework. So now your decision making, before they make a decision, they need to say, if you buy the framework, then you have to use the framework. So when they say we want to do X, you have to run numbers. They have to understand that that's the implication. So if they want, and that's why every policy changes.
Mhm.
Okay, but at this committee
Yeah.
level, shouldn't we give the model a ringing endorsement?
Yes, I think so.
And go to the next round, whatever that is? Fill in the numbers and learn how to read it ourselves
I
and
think so.
those kinds of things.
So I'm gonna jump ahead here. We are gonna be talking about budget and for the finance committee to take first pass and suggestions and such things. There's no way I'm gonna be able to do that in enough time for this package to display it to the board. So I'm gonna be using the old spreadsheets. And with that, I'm gonna have to supply the backup and everything to you guys. This is the first time that we've done this. I don't know exactly how this presentation is going to go. And we have it actually scheduled for the week of February 17th. February 17th is President's Day, so we can't do it that day. But my idea is to have the presentation of the budget, the GL accounts that go into each line, and some history with it, and the expectation of the coming year. Is there anything else that you guys think should be presented with that?
This is a presentation
Yeah.
to the finance committee,
To the finance committee before it ever gets to the
on,
board?
let's say,
Oh,
February
is
the
that what you
18th,
mean? Okay.
for review
Before it
of
goes.
the current budget proposal. Get discussion, input, and so on,
This is just for,
so that the budget can be recommended to the board at the end of February. And the board has all of February, the rest of February and into March. And by the end of March meeting,
It's for the
approve
April one.
the budget. That's the schedule out. So the first thing is for us to review the proposed budget using the old system, so to speak.
This is just a 1-year budget, right?
Yes,
Yes.
just the O&M, and then we'll talk about capital as well.
Right.
Which is 5 years from.
I don't think you can do anything but that. In other words, you know, be
Yes.
different. So reality is, you can't take a new framework and say, okay,
No,
you
no,
do
no.
this. And so,
No,
but I
there's
think
no-
that's, but I do think it would be helpful if, it goes back to a conversation, Bob, that you had of like, you know, there are 50 studies that jump out of here. Maybe there's a piece that we could also say to the board from the finance committee. We think it's really critical that these things are done, like a complete review of allocations, you know,
Right,
like from your
right.
policies. Which
Yeah.
policies are driving the big dollars? And let's tee those up for the board to say, these are the things we are asking you, in a sense, to charge us to do or someone to do. Because if not, you can't move here because your assumptions aren't going to be solid.
The plumbing inspection fee, do we keep paying the guy?
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
Yeah, how about that?
The rate fee, do we keep wanting to have an inspector who wants to give you standard language? So I think there might be a few topics that we should attach to that. But
Ones
absolutely.
that would make a difference now.
I'm sorry, but I have to leave.
One quick question.
Can you, Bob, just go over your,
Yeah, I can do that in
okay,
5 minutes.
I apologize for
No.
filling out.
No.
Thanks for everything. The quick question is do we have a charter? I think we talked about it before. Does this committee, finance committee have a charter? And back in 2021,
Mhm.
the board authorized this finance committee and listed all the responsibilities that we were supposed to carry out. I don't think we're carrying out all these responsibilities, but should we maybe revisit the board resolution and then maybe put what we think we should be doing
Update.
Yeah.
and talk about that, including all the stuff that we've discussed here today?
I think
Because
we,
if the board is putting out a resolution saying these are our responsibilities and we're not following it, that's not a good thing.
Mhm.
I think having
right,
Do we
looked
need
at
to
it,
relook at
this
that?
framework is going to help us respond to the named questions as well as 15 other things that weren't named at that time.
Mhm.
But anyway,
I think it'd be good if that got sent out to everybody before the next meeting. I have 1 or 2 things that probably should be sent out to everybody before the next meeting, just to review and say,
okay,
let's worry about
thank
this.
you very much.
And Richard,
Excellent.
you commented, thank you, on the city's missions, finance committee mission statement, which we've incorporated. So depending if you guys want this, it's a public document. It's not yet approved by the finance committee, but
Right.
get to Calvin's point, maybe it's just a document there might be pieces of it that
Be
you might,
aware
We
of
can
it.
use here.
yeah. It's not approved yet, but it's probably gonna be approved. I can send that to you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Do we have much more to do? I have all.
I
That's
have,
not my
I have
Somebody-
one thing to pass out, and
Okay.
then I'm gonna ask basically that, before the next meeting, some other things to pass out. But Richard's provided to me the UBS statements for the last year. And I went and summarized the, I'll pass this out, it's just bigger numbers, it's the bonds on it. But I just summarized last year's performance
I read that one.
for our 2 UBS accounts. And there are 2, account numbers 594 and 539. And what they started with, deposits and withdrawals, dividends and interest, and then change in market value and what it is. And the other thing Richard provided to me was that Robin's in charge of all that. So the general manager is investing $9 million at the end of, and I don't know what you've done with it, but I hope that you haven't bought any crypto or anything like that. So there is, I've learned, a statement of objectives, okay, from 2019.
2019.
Yeah. And I'd ask that we probably, and then Richard marked it up, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna suggest that we just scan this and send it out to everybody. Because he did a pretty good job of marking it up. And talk about it at a future thing, because, you know, we made roughly 4.5% last year. I don't know that that was really good versus some of the other alternatives, but that's what we made. And, you know, I'm not sure we should be investing in the stock market per se, but somewhere it seems like there's a better way to do it than what we're doing, which is addressing it to Robin, who might be knee deep in the sewage treatment plant on a day when the market's going crazy.
Who's the UBS contact for UBS? For-
I don't
Tim
know.
Reed.
It's
Mhm.
just like the
Okay, I
city,
mean, Tim, but who does he work with you?
Robin. It's with the.
Yeah,
works
it's GM and finance manager. So right now, Robin and me.
So this little discussion just started between Richard and I, but I sort of said, market was up, you know. Had we made $1 million or $2 million last year, we'd have bigger reserves and
Have you done anything with UBS? Anybody specifically work with them?
He does quarterly reviews.
Oh, I mean, that's the
Yeah.
garbage stuff that
Yeah.
comes in and says the market's beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm talking
Yeah.
about one-on-one with him. Is anybody just work one-on-one? No,
Not
you
that I'm
don't,
aware
you don't do that.
So we're starting, you know this,
Mm-hmm.
we're making a change to say there has to be a designated person, not the GM.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be you,
Mm-hmm.
who he has to report to, and he has to actually come in and talk to us. And not the global
You're
UBS
absolutely right.
portfolio, but he has to say what's happening to our accounts.
Have a specific
yes.
thing that is just you. Tell them thank you, I appreciate what's happening in the world, but I want to know what's happening with us.
Right.
And as Amy just said, you have a report specifically for just what the hell you need here.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
somebody who understands it. If you don't understand it, you don't know where to tell him to go. One of the beauties of the city's people is there's a great investment person. And then they've added other great people on there. And so I would call her and talk with her, whether she was in New York, Philadelphia, or East Jesus. We would talk and I would say, you know, we need to look at this and I don't want to lose any more money. And what's happening? I know my personal finance, how I do things, so I stay abreast of stuff. I don't want to know what's happening in the world. I want to know how can we bring in some money. So you
Great.
got to have somebody who really knows how to talk the language.
is really old and
Right.
redesign that.
Yeah.
Rather than, you know, we can avoid rate increases or we can afford capital improvements if we have some reasonable returns. And it's unfair to blame
It's a whole different.
Robin for last year's performance, although he was the general manager on December 31st.
We're a public utility. If they're saying we can gain $2 million. Well, conversely, I think we didn't lose $2 million, right?
We didn't
And
lose.
generally, in public utilities, you know, pretty safe investments. Because that's year to year. We want 5%, 6% returns. Not bad, quite frankly.
You got
I
it
think if
right.
you look at the S&P 500 index over the last 20 years, I mean, you're probably getting 6 or 7, 8%.
But you had a rocky ride along the way.
You get your right.
Well, and I think that does prompt the question, if your returns are, we have 4 banks we work with in the city, but if our returns are in the 3 to 4%, I can put them in a bank rather than UBS and have actually more conservative
Because
confidence.
right now the bank is 4.3
Yeah,
Yeah.
so
as of yesterday.
Right.
my experience with UBS, and it's exactly Carolyn's, which is he will implement what you want,
You got to
But
talk
if-
to him.
but if we don't direct,
Yes.
it's like a bookkeeper to the,
Well, if
Bookkeeper's
you have the
not supposed to
personal
question, just
person
put it
that you
in.
do your finances
Yeah.
with,
Yeah.
do you sit there and let him tell you what to do, or you say, look,
Yeah.
I need X, Y, and Z by so-and-so, so how can I get it?
Yeah.
All right, should I be changing this? Should I work the treasuries market?
Yeah.
There's all kinds
Just
of
think
stuff
about what we
to
just talked
do.
about. We don't have reserves. We have operating reserves and capital reserves. The operating reserves are liquidity reserve that's there just in case we're trying to meet cash flows. That thing probably should be in a money market fund, which right now is
You're
earning
damn right.
4.5%. And you can go to Vanguard and pay 4 basis points
You're
and you don't
damn
need
right.
an advisor for that.
Right.
Because you get more,
and you don't need it.
what you
That's
get
right.
more as a company, I mean, I thought one time when the guy told me what the CD rate was, I said, okay, well, I want that. He said, but no, that's not for individuals.
Yeah.
But there is money out there to be
There
made.
is, and I don't know what you're paying on basis points.
So for money market, we are actually not paying any fees.
But for
So
UBS,
you're-
But
But for the reserve account, we're paying 81 basis points.
So you got to be careful with all this stuff because UBS makes a lot of money.
sure they do.
So they can arrange their fee schedules. When you go to Merrill Lynch as an advisor, they're churning individual securities. You might not pay a lot on one area, but you're paying commissions and brokerage.
That's
So
right.
you have to understand how you're being paid. My suggestion would be, and I think this is great you're bringing this up. The operating funds probably should be in money market. We shouldn't be paying hardly anything for that. Right now, you're getting 4.5%. It's 1.5% above the rate of inflation, so you actually got some real return there, which is great. The capital expenditure reserves, which is the other part of this, there's a couple of interesting choices there. If you really want to get sophisticated, you could do what are called cash matching strategies. So you'd say, I need to have $8 million in 8 years. How much do I need to put away now? And is there a stripped bond that would get me there? So when it matures, I've got the money. And it's the risk-free investment for those long-term investments. Pension plans do it all the time. If you have a defined benefit pension plan,
Yep.
you cash match your liabilities. Or we could make it a little simpler and just invest those in money markets as well. But there again, you don't need to be paying advisory fees.
No.
And you don't need somebody to come in and talk to us about what's going on in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's
When you say have them come in and talk to us, I'm not in agreement with that. in that
Yeah.
respect, because unless you're a person
Yeah,
who
yeah.
really does
Yeah.
that kind of business, it's just blanketly talking to you.
Well, I understand.
I'm a different animal. I talk a different language with people
Well,
when it
okay,
comes to investments, but
but we ought
I'm
to
not
talk
gonna
about
do
it.
it.
And then, I'm sort of keying off. Mike knows a lot. You know a lot. Calvin knows a lot. Have a more or less report to this body rather than,
I think you're right. You shouldn't be talking to the
Then,
board. You should be talking to the
I mean,
finance
no
committee.
offense to the board, but
No,
it's
you don't want
not.
them talking to the board.
100%. And I think we question whether we even need a
Yes.
UBS
Yeah,
account.
that's
Okay,
right.
because
That's always on the table.
it's always on the table.
So at the Children's Beach House, we were using Vanguard
Okay.
to run the $10 million endowment over there. It's all indexed. It's very simple, but an endowment is a very different pool of funds. It's got a very different objective than a capital reserve fund,
Mhm.
but they're all different funds, right? You got pension funds, you got reserve funds, you got operating funds, you got endowment. They all have their different purposes. And they potentially would have different investment strategies and spending strategies associated with them. I think the world you
Consider what
guys
it
are
is you
in
wanna
is
do.
pretty simple.
Yeah, it
It's
is.
like a bank management.
And so with Vanguard, we had a chunk of money we needed to have in money market because of the reason for its existence. We don't pay any advisory fees for that. We just simply pay a couple of basis points for its money market. For the endowment, the corpus of the endowment, we do pay an advisory fee because they help us with spending policy over there. But that's a different animal than
That's right.
here. And I don't know how much advisory fee you pay UBS, but I bet it's big. And the question is, are you getting anything out of it?
Well, let's,
But that's a different time. Yeah.
let's
Yeah, but
circulate some information, and maybe next time the agenda item is what should we work on in the investment policy?
You know, it'd be really, Carolyn, you have much more history on this. It's, both organizations, the city and BPW, are actually going through a very similar process, okay? And I keep sitting there going, here, and also when I see theirs, why aren't we pooling our talent? Like we have two people, you know, Mary Lou and Tina, on investment strategy. They're going through exactly this
and they
conversation.
are good.
So why wouldn't we, and these are all public meetings, why wouldn't we pull them in? Not making a decision for BPW, but just how are we looking at it? How are you looking at it? We would benefit, both organizations would benefit. It's the same topic.
See, the issue is making it realize that both organizations can benefit from the same people.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's always been that BPW and city BS that I have never cared for.
Right.
That's why I'm sitting on the BPW
Yeah.
table here, because I don't separate myself like that.
No, I don't either.
And there is the talent there, just like this gentleman right here, the talent is here. Utilize it
That's what I
to the best of both, because we all live here. You
Yeah.
know,
No, exactly.
I mean, I'm serious. It's
You're
just
you're
that
right. You're
simple,
exactly right.
you know? And,
Yeah.
I mean, well, and I
But
have
two
my
different
own
entities. I
views.
would just proceed with caution. Something in my mind says having collaborated with two different entities and committees. I've never seen that.
Well, I
Actually.
don't.
No, I'm
I
not
don't-
saying it.
I'm not saying it's an ongoing committee. I'm
No,
just
me
saying
either.
with the task of investment strategy, both organizations are looking to completely revamp their investment strategy.
Yeah.
Understand that.
So I have 4 of you guys in that side. Well, why couldn't we have a meeting just on investment strategy? No other topic, and I don't know,
Like
just
side
needs some,
meetings that have, are these public meetings?
well, they have to be public meetings.
Oh, they always have to be.
Yeah.
You know, I
It's a
sent
thought for
something
you to consider.
last September. I missed the meeting last September. I was away, but I didn't know what happened to it. I suggested that we revisit the framework for the investment policy.
Oh, well, there you go.
And also the role of general manager should be reviewed and possibly replaced with the role of the committee. Policy describes role and responsibilities of the general manager where it's not clear he or she has the knowledge, experience to carry out those responsibilities. Consider the listing of responsibilities of the general manager to be carried out by the committee, and I listed a bunch of these. Did anyone ever get that?
I didn't get that. Where was that? Did you give it to
I
us?
sent it to, I wasn't here in September.
We could have very well. gotten it.
we
just don't
didn't get
remember
that,
far.
no.
But you're on point with the discussion that we
Yeah,
just had.
I think that's,
Yeah.
we need to figure
Yeah,
out
you
what we're
sent this
doing.
out?
I sent it out to,
Yeah, rather than blaming Rob
Yeah.
in next December.
No, baby, we didn't get this.
So your deadline,
That
your
doesn't
big
even look
deadline
familiar.
is the budget. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have to focus
What do
there,
I
and
need?
then I think we have to say, okay, next is
Yeah.
investment strategy.
Richard.
Those are the 2 big money pieces that
Sure.
you have, that we can start.
Never got.
Bob, you could see our agenda coming for the next year now on
Yeah,
the
okay.
finance committee.
Don't know that
Policies,
I won't be
investment.
bored.
Yeah. But Richard, when he took over, the first thing he said was, I don't want to keep doing something simply because that's the way we've always done it. He said, I want to look at everything and, make sure we're doing it the right way.